So I want to talk a little bit today about the abolition movement in the United States and how it frames our discussions and our thoughts about the institution of slavery in early America up to and through the Civil War. And so one of the things that a lot of students tend to think is that slavery and the disruption caused by the institution of slavery was a relatively new thing, that it just popped up during the Civil War. And that's not really the case for the era before the Civil War. It was always a consideration. Keep in mind that a lot of the major traders in slavery, so the Dutch and the English and the Spanish, had already started to move away from slavery 20, 30, 40 years before the Civil War began. And a lot of that was based on the discussion of slavery and I guess the morality of slavery. And so a lot of these countries have been kicking around ideas and concerns about slavery for hundreds of years before there was actual movement to abolish the practice. So with the United States, the same holds true, because they are a part of the conversation just as much as most of the Western Europeans were. And so from the earliest eras, if we think about Benjamin Lay, writing well before the United States became what we would say would be the United States, was already expressing concern to his Quaker friends, and we'll put that with capital because that's how they refer to each other, his concerns about slavery. And Benjamin Lay was, I guess, more radical than a lot of Quakers would have liked, because he would point out that they were owning slaves, even though that they were professors of peace, that they were part of the common man, that sort of thing. So he was definitely there and causing problems. And as you go through these readings, I chose a group of people who were definitely concerned with the practice of slavery in the United States, trying to figure out what's going on, how to approach it, and so on. But if we go back all the way back to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, and the writing of the Declaration of Independence, going into the U.S. Constitution, all of these things, slavery was all sort of in the background. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, who owned numerous slaves, was very concerned that if there was any movement towards abolition or any sort of abolitionist sentiment that was in these documents, that most of the South and the Southern colonies would immediately disappear from their alliance, basically. And keep in mind that in the Revolutionary War era, and just before Revolutionary War, and just after for that matter, each state was basically its own thing, and they were just sort of loosely tied together in a confederation rather than a country. And that will change pretty rapidly as the federal government sort of takes in and then starts to get power. And so what's interesting is you can go back and think about the conversations the founding fathers, in quotation marks, were having about slavery. Even then, they were trying to figure out, should we do something about this? And the answer was usually no. Now, another misconception that students have a lot of times is that the North was somehow free of slavery, or the North was all purely abolitionist or something of that nature. That's just really not true. Now, the North was definitely had a stronghold of safe areas for escaped slaves and runaway slaves. But the North was less impacted by the practice of slavery. Remember that they were more industrialized and definitely more wealthy than a lot of their southern neighbors. And so it's easier for people in the North to say, oh, the slavery thing, probably not a good thing. We can go ahead and start talking about abolishing it. It's less so for the South, because their entire economy in the southern states was almost completely dependent on the practice of slavery. So it's the way that the things worked is that in the North, most of the time you had various, and the federal government for that matter, would pass things like the Fugitive Slave Act, which was sort of a way to keep southern states from complaining too much, because it basically asked northern states, if they caught a slave, to return them to their southern masters and owners and such. And so you would have different things happen. So various northern localities would pass local laws that would say, well, we'll do that, but only if the owner comes to the north and provides documentation that this happens. And so they're sort of able to work around it because most of the time the owner doesn't want to go through the time and effort to retrieve any, what we would say, low income slaves or something like that didn't really provide them with enough profit to do so. And so one thing too, you would see also in northern states practices where the local judge would get $5 for allowing a slave to walk free to testify on his own behalf in court, and then $10 if the slave was returned to the master. So it just kind of depends on the locality, how sympathetic they were to the practice of slavery or how sympathetic they were towards abolition. As you go through these documents, you'll see Benjamin Lay talking about slavery, and again, there's all sorts of things. Benjamin Lay was not just focused on slavery, but it was certainly a concern of his, and he will sort of point out that, look, if you are enslaving other people, that means that you yourself are lazy, and actually lists them off on 24. He calls his fellow Quakers dainty, lazy, scornful, tyrannical, and often beggarly. Okay, so, and Benjamin Lay, of course, did not have a lot of Quaker friends in the lowercase sense, because he was always constantly sort of rabble-rousing amongst the Quakers, not just slavery, but just how they practiced everything and so on. So as we go through, I want to also point out, just for clarity, if you take a look at Jeremiah Gloucester in his sermon that he gives, of course, he'll mention Benjamin Lay, and really one of our first abolitionists in the country. But towards the end, on 236, Jeremiah Gloucester will mention what's known as a colonization society. Okay, and this is important to your understanding of abolitionism. There's a whole bunch of different things, and they call themselves usually societies that spring up amongst the abolitionist movements, and some are ones that we'll say are, a little more radical for the time period than others. But he mentions the colonization society, and that's one of the groups that form, and there's in various places, so it's not like one big colonization society, but just groups of them here and there. And they believed that the best thing to do would be to purchase passage back to Africa for escaped slaves or slaves that were freed, or just basically anybody of African descent who wanted to go. And what they meant by colonization was that they had purchased land in Africa that they could send these slaves back and sort of let them found their own country. And this is what is now known as modern-day Liberia. And the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after James Monroe. And if you remember in the news about 4 or 5 years ago, there was like an attempted coup/civil war that occurred in Liberia, and the U.S. got involved and basically tried to cool things down as much as possible, along with the French. And there's one of the reasons for that is Liberia's sort of the U.S. concept is not really a colony, but it wouldn't exist without these colonization societies. And you'll see that Jeremiah Gloucester said, look, this is just an end around. You're not going to be able to send everybody back. Okay, there's going to be people who want to stay here and try to make their way, because this is the only home they've ever known. So as you think about this, there's 2 other societies that you may find in your reading or in your research. One of them is known as a manumission society. Manumission societies were very unique in that their practice was to purchase slaves and transport them to the north or transport them to Canada and then let them go. And so they would just basically tell the slave, hey, we purchased you, here's your paperwork that says that you're free now, and so on. So it was a very blunt way of trying to subvert slavery, but also paid for slaves too, and kind of kept the practice going in that regard. So manumission societies, and 2, the paperwork that they handed to the slaves could often just be straightforward denied by their owners or by anybody who captured somebody who suspected they were a fugitive or escaped slave and tried to return those, or just destroyed. So manumission societies were there as kind of a feel-good attempt to be abolitionist. And then the final one that you'll hear about more is what's known as a vigilance society or vigilance committee. And those were definitely the more radical of the groups, but also ones that practiced well within the realms of the law usually. And they would just be groups of people who would agree to help escaped slaves. And so vigilance societies were usually the ones that were functioning on what we knew as the Underground Railroad, which is something that you probably already know everything about, or a lot about. But also on top of that too, with vigilance societies, is that they would often have groups of attorneys or politicians who would work hard to represent slaves who had escaped and had made their way to the north and were being hunted by bounty hunters or by escaped slave or by slave owners, those sorts of things. So vigilance societies are kind of like, I guess, a way of putting it is our modern day, in some ways, ACLU, in that they just have a bunch of attorneys, and if there's any problems, like you give them a call and they'll come along and file lawsuits on your behalf and sort of look out for you and give you representation in the courts one way or the other. Politics aside, that's just the way the ACLU functions. If you have a civil liberty that you feel is violated, they kind of provide you with attorneys and moral support and political support and so on. So the vigilance committees were very much like that. And that's really what we think about when we think about abolition and in our modern context, and the abolition movement, Underground Railroad, all sort of wrapped up in these vigilance committees. And so a lot of the debate around abolition is, how do we do it, right? If we can't do it politically at this point in time, how can we sort of fight back against the system? And we had multiple answers. So we have colonization, is send slaves back, purchase their freedom, manumission, let them go somewhere else, and then vigilance, which is represent them in court and sort of muck up the process, try to really interrogate the laws that exist, and then agitate for change from there. So one other thing too is, as we think about Frances Ann Kimball and her writings, and she had a whole book, but Thoughts on Slavery. Of course, she's English and she comes to Georgia to see slavery in action, and she has various arguments against slavery. And the thing that's fascinating is on page 10, she says, and this is a long response to another letter that I don't think we have kept for posterity and history, but this person provides a bunch of arguments for slavery and she pushes back. And one of the things she says on page 10 is, Mr. Whoever and many others speak as if there were a natural repugnance in all whites to any alliance with the black race. And she says, and yet it is notorious that almost every Southern planter has a family more or less numerous of illegitimate colored children. And so that's really a hardcore thing for somebody to say during this time period. But everybody knew, that one of the purposes for slaves, especially female slaves, during this time period was for breeding, for the masters and the male people in the family to have sex with, and so on, and sexually assault. It's no surprise even during this era, and when Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and that whole thing came out, it was fascinating watching popular culture be like, oh no, not Thomas Jefferson, whereas most historians are like, of course Thomas, and so on, because it was such a widespread practice during that time period. So if you read these, think about the arguments that Sarah Ann Kimball and then also Benjamin Franklin put forward towards slavery and the possible abolishment of it. But really the thing that I want you to derive from these readings is that it's not a new concept, this idea of abolition or escaping from slavery or turning over the institution of slavery is something that was going on almost from the moment it started. It just started to become more and more widespread amongst other circles, started to coalesce around certain movements. So as you read these documents, think about what they're saying in regards to slavery and how they're approaching it, their philosophies towards it, and that would be the way to go. And we'll talk more about this stuff online as well.